Hello, and welcome to History's Forgotten People. Now picture the scene. It's January, New Year's is over. You've eaten the last of the good food. You've drank the last of the really strong ale. And now you're standing in your medieval barn and doing some pretty grim arithmetic. The grain from last year's August harvest is running very low, as is the salted pork from November. On top of this, your cow won't produce any more milk until she calves again in the spring. And your chickens, well, they've basically stopped laying eggs because, unlike modern hens, they need daylight, and there isn't much of that in a British January. And the first fresh food of the year? That's still months away. Welcome to the Hungry Gap, a period of the year annually when medieval European people would face the very real possibility of starving to death. Not because of war or plague or some exceptional disaster, but simply because of the seasons. The Hungry Gap ran roughly from late February through to May, with April being the worst month of all, even though the Anglo-Saxons called March the cruel month. But you see, it was after this point when the worst really happened, when everything ran out at once. By April, all of your grain had run out, most of your meat was probably spoiled or had already been eaten, and even the root vegetables you stored in pits over the winter had also been eaten or spoiled. You were stuck between the food from last year running out and the food from the new year not yet being around, and if you didn't have enough stored up, you might not make it across. Here's the thing about medieval food storage. It was actually quite sophisticated, but it did have hard limits. Grain was the foundation of everything. It provided around 80% of the calories for a peasant family. You stored it unthreshed on the stalk in your barn and threshed it as you needed it. This helped protect it somewhat, but it was still vulnerable to rot, mice, weevils, and to a particularly nasty fungus called ergot, which could produce hallucinations and even death if you ate it. You kept cats to deal with the mice. You hoped for the best with everything else. Meat preservation centred on a single date, Martinmas, the 11th of November. Anglo-Saxons called November the blood month for obvious reasons. This was when you slaughtered the animals that were not likely to make it through the winter anyway. Pork was especially favoured because once you salted it, it took on less salt than other meats and it retained its moisture better. You soaked the meat in brine, you hung it to dry in your chimney or a smoking house. You soaked the meat in brine, hung it to dry, and then smoked it in your chimney or a dedicated smoking house. You used every part of the animal, fat for cooking and candles, bones and hooves for tools and glue, and the hide for leather. Nothing was wasted because nothing could afford to be wasted. But if you got any part of the process wrong, too much salt, not enough salt, if you didn't wash it off properly before you ate it, because even preserved meat had to be soaked before you ate it, you still wouldn't make it through to the spring. Root vegetables helped. Turnips, parsnips, onions and carrots, they were all placed into special pits which would be layered with straw or sand, and they could be kept in there for 4 to 6 months. We'd keep them dry and hopefully stop them from rotting. Some vegetables could even stay in the ground until you needed to eat them and they could be pulled up then, especially in England where the climate was mild enough that the ground rarely froze completely. Dried peas and beans lasted longer than anything else, and these became valuable protein sources when very little was left. So, what did people actually eat during these really thin months? Well, they ate something called pottage. This was a kind of soup or stew that you would put on in a big pot and leave it going for days or maybe even weeks at a time. You kept adding things, whatever you had around you. Oats, barley, turnips, onions, carrots, bits of meat, bits of fish. Anything at all went in the pot, and as time went on, it would grow thinner and thinner, more watered down and less substance, but still something to eat. It wasn't food to be enjoyed, this was survival food. Bread came in many grades and of course reflected where you were in society. White bread with flour sifted 2 or 3 times, graced only the tables of royalty and nobility. Common people ate brown bread with the husks still in it. And right at the bottom of society, there was something called horse bread. This was peas and beans ground up with whatever wheat that was as coarse as possible could be put together, and it was called horse bread because it was normally given to horses. The irony being that nowadays it would probably be the most expensive choice of the three. The poet William Langland, writing in the 14th century, described people using the coarsest wheat possible, the oldest shriveled peas and beans they could find, just to try and make any bread of substance to see them through these terrible months. And even ale mattered more than you might think. Ale wasn't like modern alcohol. It was very low percentage, probably 1% or less, and it was thicker, more like a kind of loose porridge than a drink, really. It provided vital calories for people when there was no solid food around. A gallon a day wasn't unusual for working people, and the process of making it killed off the harmful bacteria that was often found in water. When there was very little food left, ale could help people survive the hungry gap. When normal food ran out, people turned to famine foods. Bark, nuts, any wild plants that they were able to eat. Acorns, normally given only to pigs, were eaten by humans. When nettles appeared in February, they were a genuine lifeline, providing iron and vitamins, especially when put into a soup with a bit of wild garlic and oats. And wild garlic itself appeared in March across woodlands, unmistakable with its distinctive smell. Human survival was intimately linked to knowledge of wild plants and... No, I give up. Even wild garlic itself appeared in March across woodlands, unmistakable with its distinctive smell. Human survival was intimately linked to knowledge of wild plants. When your garden vegetables ran out, wild plants appeared just in time to see you through the thin months. And of course, the hungry gap hit different people in very different ways. According to a survey from 1279, half of English farmers held less than 10 acres. That was barely enough to look after a family in normal times. Another third owned a little more, but not enough to give them any cushion. And of course, those hit hardest were landless labourers, the elderly, the sick, children, widows. These people had to rely on gleaning the leftover wheat cuts, taking day labour where possible, and basically just hoping for the best. The wealthy, meanwhile, had extensive advantages. Royalty, nobility, and even monasteries had well-managed farms producing diverse foods. They had well-stocked grain stores. By the 12th century, half of England's forests were designated royal hunting grounds. This meant any peasants found poaching could face imprisonment or even death. Although, when you consider that the alternative was likely to starve to death anyway, we can understand why many of them took the risk. The deer that peasants weren't even allowed to touch created a substantial amount of the meat on royal tables. Monasteries tried to help where they could, distributing food at their gates, but even they couldn't bridge the gap for everyone. Every year, the hungry gap was dangerous, but occasionally it became catastrophic. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 began with extreme wet weather in autumn 1314, followed by relentless rain through 1315 and 1316. An incessant downpour, day and night, such as no one living had ever seen. Crops couldn't ripen in the cool, wet conditions. Grain brought inside to keep dry rotted anyway. Hay and straw for animals couldn't be cured, so there was no fodder for livestock. Waterlogged soil made ploughing impossible. Scholars estimate that between 10 to 25% of the population died in these few years alone. Chronicles record that people were eating horses and dogs and cats. There were records in Bristol of prisoners pouncing on new arrivals and devouring them. Children were left to fend for themselves, inspiring tales like Hansel and Gretel. The old chose voluntary starvation so that their younger members in their families could actually have a chance to live. In London, 52 people died during a stampede when charity food was given out. Even King Edward II, stopping in St Albans in 1315, struggled to find bread, any bread, for himself and his retinue. Relief from the hungry gap finally came, tracked by the agricultural calendar. By late February and March, cows were calving again, and it wouldn't be long after that they would begin producing milk. From late January through to April, lambs would be born. But the main grain harvest still wouldn't come until August, and any vegetables planted in the spring, well, you'd have to wait a few more months until they were ripe and ready to eat. And here's something else in the medieval world that makes sense once you know about the hungry gap, and that's Lent. The word comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for spring, indicating the lengthening of days, and Lent falls smack bang in the middle of the hungry gap. The church required people to avoid meat from warm-blooded animals, dairy, eggs, precisely the foods that were unavailable during the hungry gap. Instead, they advocated fish, which preserved much better and was much more readily available. Lent in the medieval period wasn't just theological, it was about survival. Religious and political leaders no doubt realised that if they did nothing, they would have riots on their hands as people starved. So they dressed up economic necessity as spiritual duty. The hungry gap reveals medieval life at its most precarious. For ordinary people, the months from February to May weren't just not very nice and cold or inconvenient, they were a survival test encoded into the very heart of medieval agricultural society. The sophisticated but limited preservation methods, the centrality of pottage and ale, the need to forage common land just to survive. These were parts of medieval life that we've largely forgotten but would have been taken for granted back then, simply as a way of life if you were not royalty or nobility. We think of famine as something exceptional, something that happens when there's a catastrophe. For medieval people, famine was a real and ever-present danger every single year once winter was through. For medieval people, the hungry gap was a reminder that the space between the last harvest and the next was not guaranteed. And every year, they all had to try to cross that gap. And every year, many of them never made it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.